Welcome to Grey Vale Echoes. Dive into chilling gothic horror, where haunted castles, ghostly secrets, and eerie relics unravel terrifying truths. Join us for spine-tingling tales of the unknown. Tonight, we journey to the decaying Mardykes Hall, a place of forgotten sorrows. Join us as Sir Bale Mardykes returns to his ancestral home, only to discover that some family secrets refuse to stay buried. The journey to Mardykes Hall had been a pilgrimage into a past Sir Bale Mardykes had spent the better part of his adult life trying to outrun. It was not a return of triumph, nor one of fond nostalgia, but a reluctant surrender to the duties of inheritance. As his hired carriage, a sturdy but weary vehicle, turned off the main thoroughfare, the world seemed to change. The well-maintained road gave way to a deeply rutted track, a ghost of a path that was slowly being reclaimed by nature. The trees, which had stood at a respectful distance before, now closed in, their branches interlocking overhead to form a dense, gloomy canopy that starved the path of the day's fading light. They were ancient oaks and elms, their bark thick with moss and their forms twisted into arthritic, tormented shapes. Their bare, skeletal branches clawed at the bruised twilight sky, reaching down towards the carriage like the gnarled fingers of desperate, drowning men. The air grew still and heavy, carrying the damp, loamy scent of decay. For the last mile, the only sounds were the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves, the weary creak of the carriage's suspension, and the low, anxious breathing of Sir Bale himself. And then, he saw it, emerging from the gloom like a half-forgotten nightmare. The gate. It was the first true testament to the profound and patient decay that had taken root at the heart of his family's legacy. Forged from heavy, black iron, its design was severe and forbidding, with spear-like points that aimed accusingly at the heavens. It was choked with a deep, corrosive rust that flaked away in brittle reddish-brown scales, like dried blood. A thick, gnarled vine, as thick as a man's arm, had wrapped itself around one side of the gate, its parasitic grip so tight and relentless over the uncounted years that it had visibly bent the solid iron, a testament to nature's slow, silent, and inevitable victory over the works of man. On one of the two great stone pillars that flanked the entrance, the family name, Mardykes Hall, was just barely visible. The carved letters had been worn smooth by a century of relentless wind and lashing rain, almost entirely erased from existence, as if the world itself were trying to forget the place had ever been named. The driver, a grim-faced local man who had barely spoken a word the entire journey, brought the horse to a halt. He climbed down from his seat, and with a great, groaning heave that spoke of immense effort, he forced the gate open. It didn't swing. It scraped, its protest a high, shrieking, metallic sound that was hideously loud in the oppressive quiet, an agonizing cry that echoed into the silent woods and died without reply. As the carriage rolled through the opening, Sir Bale felt a tangible shift in the atmosphere, a palpable sense of crossing a threshold not just onto a piece of property, but into a place that time and perhaps even God had abandoned. The house itself did not rise to greet him so much as it loomed. It was a dark, hulking beast of gray stone, squatting at the end of the overgrown drive, its sharp, gothic angles and tall, narrow windows giving it a severe, almost malevolent expression against the bruised purple of the evening sky. It seemed to devour what little light remained in the day, absorbing it into its very foundations, leaving the world around it in a deeper shade of twilight. Not a single lamp burned in any of its vacant, eye-like windows. They were black, empty sockets that stared out over the decaying estate with a blind, indifferent gaze. The roof sagged noticeably in the middle, like the broken spine of some great, prehistoric creature that had collapsed here to die. A chimney on the west wing had partially crumbled, leaving a jagged, open wound in the slate, a dark maw exposed to the elements. The air grew heavier and colder as he finally stepped out of the carriage, the sound of his boots crunching on the weed-choked gravel seeming like an act of vandalism in the profound stillness. The wind, which had been a mere whisper in the woods, now picked up with a sudden, vindictive force, whipping around the corners of the mansion with a purpose. It wasn't a clean, natural wind. It was a low, mournful howl, a desolate sound that seemed to be a symphony of every sorrow the house had ever witnessed. It moaned through the skeletal trees, rattled the window panes with a persistent, desperate rhythm, and seemed to carry on its breath a silent, indecipherable whisper. Taking a deep, steadying breath of the damp, earthy air, Sir Bale made his way up the three wide stone steps that led to the main entrance. They were slick with a fine green moss, treacherous and unwelcoming. The door was a colossal slab of dark, weathered oak, almost black with age and studded with rows of large, rusted iron bolts. It looked less like a door and more like a barricade. In its center was a heavy, ring-shaped knocker, fashioned in the image of a snarling gargoyle's head. With a sense of grim finality, he lifted the cold, heavy iron ring and let it fall. The sound was not the sharp rap he expected. but a dead, hollow, percussive thud that was immediately swallowed by the immense, sound-absorbing presence of the house. It was as if he had knocked on the lid of a stone sarcophagus. He waited. The wind howled. The silence within the house remained absolute. A solid, unbreachable wall. No footsteps approached from within, no light appeared. It was clear no one was coming. Acting on a sudden impulse born of frustration, he reached for the large, ornate handle, a cold, smooth piece of black iron. He did not expect it to turn, but to his surprise it did, with a low, grinding click from the mechanism deep within the door. With a great, groaning protest of ancient, rusted hinges, the colossal door swung slowly inward, opening into a vast, cavernous darkness that seemed to push back at him. A physical wave of cold, stagnant air. He hesitated for only a moment on the threshold before stepping inside. As soon as his second foot cleared the frame, the great door, moved by a sudden draft or some unseen weight of its own, swung shut behind him. It closed not with a simple click, but with a deafening, resounding boom that echoed like a cannon shot through the cavernous space. The vibration traveled from the stone floor, up through the soles of his boots, and into his very bones, a final, emphatic pronouncement of his entrapment. He was sealed inside. The great hall was even colder than the air outside. A deep, sepulchral chill that clung to his clothes and seemed to seep directly into his flesh. A damp and penetrating cold that felt ancient and unnatural. With a slightly trembling hand, he lit the tallow candle he had brought with him. Its single, flickering flame was a tiny, brave, and utterly pathetic star in an infinite universe of shadows. The light did little to push back the oppressive, ink-black darkness. In fact, it seemed only to make the shadows deeper, more active, more menacing. They retreated from the immediate vicinity of the flame but gathered in strength just beyond its reach, clinging to the corners of the vast room, huddling beneath the grand, sweeping staircase that led to the upper floors, and pooling in the empty space where the high, vaulted ceiling was lost entirely to the gloom. The weak, dancing light gave the shadows a semblance of life, making them writhe and twist as if they were living things, resentful of his intrusion. Every sound he made was grotesquely amplified by the tomb-like acoustics of the hall. The soft scuff of his leather boot on the flagstone floor echoed like a sharp crack. The whisper-light rustle of his wool coat as he shifted his weight sounded like dry, dead leaves skittering across a gravestone. The silence here was not an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered all noise and seemed to press in on him from all sides with a palpable weight. It was the silence of a place that had not heard a human voice in a generation, a silence that had grown ancient and powerful. His nervous candlelight danced across the walls, momentarily illuminating the portraits of his ancestors. Generations of Mardykes men and women stared out from their dark, gilded frames. Their faces were uniformly stern, their lips set in thin lines of disapproval, their painted eyes lost in the shadows. As the light flickered, it created the unnerving illusion that their eyes were moving, following his progress across the hall, their silent, collective gaze a heavy burden of judgment for his return to a home he had so long neglected. The air was thick and cloying, heavy with the layered sense of damp stone, wet rot, and the pervasive powdery scent of undisturbed dust, the smell of forgotten memories and slow, inexorable decay. It felt as though the house itself were a living entity, a vast, sleeping behemoth. He could almost feel the slow, cold beat of its stone heart in the oppressive silence, could feel its ancient, malevolent consciousness stirring from a long slumber, now aware of his presence. In that moment, Sir Bael Mardykes understood with chilling clarity that he was not a master returning to his ancestral home. He was an intruder, a trespasser in a place that no longer belonged to the living, a place that now belonged only to its ghosts, its sorrows, and its long-buried secrets. Standing frozen in the paralyzing cold of the great hall, a profound and weary exhaustion settled deep into Sir Bael Mardykes's bones. His logical mind, the part of him that had navigated the complexities of London society and the pragmatic demands of his life, screamed at him with a single, desperate command. Find refuge. Find a room, any room that was not this one, a chamber with a door that could be bolted and a fireplace that could be coaxed back to life. His entire being yearned for the simple, primal comfort of a barrier against the oppressive, watching dark and a small circle of warmth to beat back the sepulchral chill. He was a man of reason, and reason dictated survival, and survival in this place meant finding a defensible corner and waiting for the cold, gray comfort of the morning sun. Yet, as he stood there, formulating a plan to retreat, another sensation began to make itself known. It started as a subtle, almost imperceptible feeling, a quiet but insistent summons from deep within the house's shadowy heart. It was not a sound, not a voice he could hear with his ears, but rather a silent whisper that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. a current in the stagnant atmosphere that tugged at some forgotten part of his soul. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of his overwrought nerves, a phantom of his fatigue. But the feeling did not fade. It grew stronger, more focused, a strange and unsettling magnetism that began to override his logic and his fear. He felt an inexplicable compulsion, a pull towards the upper floors, toward the labyrinthine, unknown corridors that lay shrouded in the darkness above. It felt as if a thread, invisible and ethereal, had been tied to his spirit, and now, an unseen hand was beginning to tug upon it, gently but with an undeniable and irresistible firmness. He had no desire to explore this derelict mausoleum. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to stay put or to flee, and yet, he found his feet beginning to move as if of their own accord. He turned away from the relative safety of the hall and towards the grand staircase, its wide, sweeping form looking like the immense, fossilized ribcage of some long-dead leviathan. He had become a puppet, and the house itself held the strings. He began the ascent, his hand trailing lightly on the thick, dust-coated wooden banister. The wood was unnaturally cold, a deep and penetrating cold that seemed to draw the warmth from his fingertips. He climbed into an even deeper darkness, his single candle casting a nervous, quivering pool of light around him that seemed pitifully inadequate against the encroaching gloom. The grand staircase, which might have once been a statement of wealth and power, was now an instrument of dread. Each step he took was met with a low, protracted groan from the ancient wood, a melancholy, mournful sound that was unnaturally loud in the profound silence. It sounded like the complaints of a dying man, each breath a painful effort. The flickering flame of his candle threw his own shadow onto the wall beside him, distorting it into a monstrous, elongated figure that seemed to climb with him, a dark and silent companion dogging his every step. The shadows cast by the balusters were like the bars of a cage, trapping him as he rose higher and higher into the belly of the house. Reaching the second floor, he stepped into a hallway that was a long, narrow throat of shadow. If the great hall had been cavernous and vast, this corridor was constricting, its walls seeming to press inward. More portraits lined the walls here, ancestors from more recent, more tragic generations. Unlike the stern and judging figures below, the faces here were different. Their expressions were not of power, but of profound and inconsolable sorrow. There was a woman whose eyes were wide with a silent terror, a young man whose handsome features were marred by a deep, brooding melancholy. Their painted eyes, rendered with a lifelike and unsettling skill, seemed to hold a desperate, silent warning. They followed him as he moved, their collective gaze a tapestry of misery that seemed to say, "Turn back." The carpet under his feet, once a rich crimson, was now faded to the color of a dried bloodstain, its fabric threadbare, revealing the dark floorboards beneath. With every step, clouds of dust puffed up around his ankles, the disturbed motes dancing in the candlelight like a swarm of ghostly insects. Halfway down this corridor of sorrow, the strange, invisible pull that had guided him this far intensified dramatically. It ceased to be a gentle tug and became a focused, undeniable command, drawing his attention to a single door at the far end of the hallway. It was immediately obvious that this door was different from all the others. While the bedroom doors were tall and elegantly carved from a lighter oak, this one was short, stout, and fashioned from a dark, almost black wood that seemed to have absorbed all light. It was brutally plain, bare of any carving or ornament, held together by 3 thick, black iron straps. It looked ancient, out of place, as if it belonged to a much older, cruder version of the house that had been built over and hidden away. And he knew, with a sudden, sickening jolt of certainty that had nothing to do with reason, what it was. It was the door to the attic. A memory, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, pierced through the fog of time, a forgotten fragment of his childhood rushing back with terrifying clarity. He was a boy of 6 or 7, standing in this very hallway. He remembered the scent of his grandmother's lavender perfume, a scent that was always at odds with her severe personality. She was a woman of stern features and even sterner words, and she was pointing a long, bony finger at that very door, her face a mask of grim seriousness. "That place," she had said, her voice low and devoid of any warmth, "is not for the children of this house. It is not for anyone. Some things, Bale, are best left undisturbed. Some doors are best left locked." The warning, dismissed by a child's fleeting attention, now returned to him with the full weight of a prophecy. It echoed in his mind, a ghostly voice trying to hold him back. But the pull, the compulsion from the house, was stronger than the ghost of a warning. The forbidden nature of the place only intensified the draw, twisting his fear into a dark and morbid curiosity. He reached the end of the hall and stood before the door, the dark wood seeming to radiate a palpable cold. He ran his hand over its rough, splintered surface. It was a barrier, a seal on a part of the house that was meant to be forgotten. His eyes scanned the wall beside the door, and in the flickering light he saw it. Hanging on a single rusty iron hook was a key. It was large and archaic, forged from blackened iron, its head shaped like a simple clover. It was coated in a thick layer of dust and draped with a delicate lacework of cobwebs, suggesting it had not been touched in a lifetime. It seemed too convenient, too simple, as if it had been left for him. It was not a discovery. It was an invitation. His hand trembled slightly as he took the key from its hook. It was heavy in his palm, its iron form icy cold, a stark and solid piece of the house's chilling reality. With a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of his heart, he inserted the key into the large, rusted lock. The fit was perfect. The sound of the metal scraping against the rusted tumblers within the lock was a sharp, grating noise that set his teeth on edge. He turned it. For a moment, there was resistance, a stubborn refusal. He applied more pressure, his knuckles white. Then, with a final, piercingly loud click that was as sharp and definitive as a snapping bone, the lock gave way. The sound seemed to break the spell of the house's silence, a moment of violent intrusion that felt utterly irreversible. He had breached the final barrier. He had unlocked the forbidden place. He grasped the small iron ring that served as a handle and pulled. The door was heavy, and it opened with a low, protracted groan of protest, the sound of ancient, tortured wood moving for the first time in decades. As it swung inward, it revealed not a room, but a wall of absolute, impenetrable darkness. From that opening, a wave of cold, musty air rushed out to meet him, an exhalation from the lungs of the house. It was a cold that was profoundly different from the chill in the rest of the mansion. This was a deep, stagnant cold, the cold of a sealed tomb, and with it came the smell. It was a complex and horrifying bouquet of scents that assaulted his senses all at once. First, there was the dry, powdery smell of ancient dust and the damp, earthy scent of rotting wood. Beneath that was the sharper, more acrid smell of mildew and decay, the odor of things slowly turning back to the earth in a place without light or air. But it was the last scent, a faint ghost of a smell that coiled beneath the others, that made the blood run cold in his veins. It was the sweet, cloying, and heartbreakingly familiar scent of dried flowers, brittle and faded, the unmistakable fragrance of a funeral wreath left to crumble into dust over an unvisited grave. The darkness before him seemed solid, a presence in itself, a living void that drank his candlelight and gave nothing back. He had answered the house's call, and now he stood on the precipice of its darkest secret, the forbidden memories of Mardykes Hall waiting for him in the suffocating blackness of the attic. Taking a breath that felt thin and useless in the stagnant air, Sir Bael Mardykes raised his candle and took the final, decisive step. He crossed the threshold from the relative familiarity of the hallway into the absolute, smothering blackness of the attic. The oppressive darkness seemed to resist him, a physical pressure against his skin, and the door swung shut behind him with a soft, final click, the sound swallowed instantly by a silence far more profound than any he had yet encountered in the house. This was not the watchful, waiting silence of the great hall. This was the dead, absolute silence of a sealed tomb, a place where sound itself had long since died. His single candle flame, which had seemed so brave and defiant moments before, now appeared pitifully small, a tiny pinprick of light fighting a losing battle against an ocean of darkness. The air was thick, heavy, and difficult to draw into his lungs. It carried the layered scents he had first detected, the dry, choking smell of ancient dust, the damp, earthy aroma of slow-moving rot, but now, inside the sealed space, they were overpowering, clinging to the back of his throat. And beneath it all, the ghostly, sweet scent of dried, funeral flowers was stronger, a constant, heartbreaking reminder of forgotten grief. His first hesitant steps forward landed on a floor blanketed in a layer of dust so thick and fine that it felt like walking on velvet. His boots left the first marks the space had seen in generations, dark, stark prints in the gray landscape that felt like a desecration. He held his candle high, its weak, trembling light beginning to carve shapes out of the gloom. The attic was not empty. It was a graveyard of a family's forgotten life, a chaotic jumble of discarded memories. All around him, spectral shapes emerged from the darkness. He saw furniture, draped in white dust cloths that had yellowed with age. They looked like a congregation of hunched, mournful figures, their forms distorted into sleeping giants or crouching beasts. One was unmistakably the shape of a rocking chair, another a large, stately wardrobe, its doors slightly ajar, revealing a deeper blackness within. He saw the skeletal frame of a child's cradle, its gentle curve a sad monument to a life that had once filled this house with sound. Each object was a ghost, shrouded in its own dusty cerement, a silent witness to the passage of time and the slow decay of a family's fortunes. From the high, unseen rafters, cobwebs hung not in delicate strands, but in thick gray ropes, heavy with the dust of ages. They swayed gently in the imperceptible draughts his presence created, moving with a slow, hypnotic grace like spectral curtains or the hanging weeds of a deep, dark sea. As he moved deeper into the room, one of these strands brushed against his cheek, a cold, dry, and utterly revolting kiss that made him flinch back with a sharp intake of breath. The space was larger than he had imagined, the ceiling slanting steeply on either side, creating cramped, claustrophobic corners where the darkness was absolute, where his small light could not penetrate. The attic was a repository of all that the Mardykes family had wished to forget, a physical manifestation of its repressed history, and he felt like a trespasser violating a sacred, if sorrowful, space. His weak light crawled over piles of leather-bound books, their spines cracked and their pages warped by damp, their stored knowledge turning to mold. He saw stacks of old newspapers, their headlines announcing victories and scandals from a world that no longer existed. He was wading through the detritus of dead ambitions and forgotten days. As his eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, he began to scan the cluttered landscape more methodically. His gaze drifted over a stack of rusted trunks, a broken birdcage, a collection of porcelain dolls with cracked faces and empty eyes that seemed to watch him from the floor. And then he saw it. In the far corner of the attic, set against the rough stone of the chimney breast, stood an object that was different from the rest. It was not part of the random chaos. It was singular, tall, and deliberate. Unlike the other furniture, which was draped in pale, almost translucent dust cloths, this object was completely hidden under a thick, heavy sheet of rough, brown canvas. It stood out from the surrounding clutter not because of its shape, but because of the care with which it had been concealed. Everything else in this room had been discarded. This felt as if it had been deliberately and purposefully hidden away, a secret entombed within a secret. The strange, invisible pull he had felt in the hallway returned. No longer a gentle tug, but a focused, undeniable summons. This was the source. This was what the house had wanted him to find. He began to move towards it, his path a careful, deliberate obstacle course. He had to step over a collapsed armchair that seemed to reach out with its broken springs, and navigate around a set of stacked crates that threatened to topple over at the slightest touch. Each step was slow, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm of fear and anticipation. The dust on the floor muffled his footfalls, making his journey across the attic unnervingly silent. As he drew closer, he could see that the canvas covering was thick with grime and streaked with water stains from some long-ago leak in the roof. It was tied at the bottom with a thick, fraying piece of rope, the knot still tight and secure. Someone had not wanted this to be seen. He reached the veiled figure and stood before it, the air around it seeming colder, heavier. He placed his candle on a nearby crate, its flame steadying in the still air, and reached out a trembling hand. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering just above the coarse fabric. A final wave of his grandmother's warning washed over him. Some things are best left undisturbed. But it was too late for warnings. He was here. He had come this far. With a deep breath, he took hold of the rough canvas. It was stiff and gritty to the touch. With a single, decisive pull, he tore the covering away. The heavy sheet fell to the floor in a heap, releasing an explosive cloud of thick, gray dust into the air. The cloud was so dense it momentarily eclipsed the candlelight, plunging him into darkness. He choked, waving a hand in front of his face, the ancient dust filling his nose and mouth with a dry, gritty taste. It was like disturbing a grave, and for a moment he felt a profound sense of violation. As the dust cloud slowly began to settle, thinning like a dissipating fog, the candlelight once again found the object. It was a painting, a massive, dark, oil portrait in a heavy, ornate, gilded frame that was now tarnished and black. It was a formal portrait of the Mardykes family, perhaps from a century or more ago. He saw a stern-faced patriarch with a familiar Mardykes jawline, a severe-looking woman beside him, and several stiff, formally dressed children arranged around them. Their faces were grim, their expressions unhappy, their bodies rigid. They looked less like a family and more like a collection of prisoners, trapped for eternity in the dark, cracked varnish. He felt a distant, cold sense of connection to these people, his forebears, but it was a connection tinged with the profound melancholy that seemed to permeate every stone of the house. But his eyes were not drawn to the central figures. They were pulled, as if by a physical force, to a woman standing slightly to the side, almost at the edge of the family group, as if she were an afterthought. She was younger than the others, beautiful in a fragile, sorrowful way, but it was her eyes that held him captive. While the other figures in the portrait were rendered with a stiff, formal quality, The eyes of this woman were painted with a shocking, breathtaking realism. They were wide, dark, and luminous, and they held a depth of sorrow so profound it seemed impossible to have been captured with mere paint and oil. They seemed wet, glistening in the candlelight as if with unshed tears. The artist had not just painted a likeness. He had painted a soul in torment. And that soul was now staring directly at him. A deep, visceral chill, colder than any he had yet felt, snaked its way up his spine and settled in the base of his skull. He took an involuntary step back, his boot catching on the discarded canvas. He felt an intense, prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the primal, instinctual feeling of being watched. It was absurd. It was a painting, nothing more than canvas and dried pigment. And yet he could not shake the feeling. Her gaze was locked onto his. He moved a step to his left, his own eyes never leaving hers. Her painted eyes seemed to shift, their focus following him. He moved again to the right, and the illusion persisted, perfect and unbroken. No matter where he stood in the small circle of light cast by his candle, the woman's tragic, heartbreaking gaze was fixed upon him. It was an old trick of the painter's art, he told himself, a clever use of perspective. He had heard of such things, of portraits whose eyes seemed to follow the viewer around a room. But to experience it here, in the dead silence of this forgotten attic, was to feel the fragile boundary between the rational and the supernatural dissolve into nothing. He stared back, mesmerized, and his attention shifted from her eyes to her mouth. She had a faint, painted smile, but it was a smile that held no joy, no warmth. It was the slightest upturn of the lips, a gesture of profound and bitter irony. As he watched, the flickering candlelight seemed to play tricks on her expression. One moment, the smile seemed to be one of pure, heartbreaking sadness, a mask of pity for a fate she could not escape. The next, as the flame dipped, the shadows deepened around her mouth, and the smile transformed into something else entirely. It became a sneer, a look of cold, knowing mockery. It was a smile that knew a secret, a terrible secret that he was only just beginning to uncover. It seemed to mock his ignorance, his fear, his very presence in her long-held sanctum of sorrow. She was not just a figure in a painting. She was a presence. She was watching him, judging him. Her unblinking gaze a silent accusation. Her mocking smile a promise of the horrors that lay hidden behind her painted eyes. Sir Mardykes stood frozen, a prisoner held captive by a gaze of painted sorrow. The silence in the attic pressed in on him, a heavy, suffocating weight, and the only sound was the frantic, panicked drumming of his own heart against his ribs. The woman in the portrait dominated his senses. Her eyes, so full of a lifelike, luminous grief, had become the focal point of his world, and her faint, mocking smile seemed to twist and writhe in the unsteady candlelight. His rational mind fought a desperate, losing battle against the encroaching tide of primal fear. It was paint, he told himself, a clever arrangement of pigments on canvas. It was a trick of the light, a figment of his exhausted and overstimulated imagination. But his body knew better. The cold sweat that trickled down his temples and the uncontrollable tremor in his hands were testaments to a deeper, more instinctual truth. He was in the presence of something profoundly unnatural, something that had waited in this forgotten corner of his ancestral home, patient and watchful, for a very long time. He felt an overwhelming, morbid compulsion to draw closer, to bridge the small gap of air that separated him from the canvas, as if by proximity he could somehow solve the riddle of her haunting gaze. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his boot making a soft, crunching sound in the thick dust. Then another. He moved as if in a trance, drawn by the unnerving power of her eyes. As he neared the portrait, a new and startling sensation washed over him. The air directly in front of the painting was icy cold. It was not the general damp chill of the attic, but a focused, localized pocket of intense, biting cold, a stark and unnatural contrast to the musty air in the rest of the room. It felt as if he were standing before the open door of a crypt. The cold radiated outward from the canvas in palpable waves, a supernatural aura that seemed to emanate directly from the figure of the sorrowful woman. It clung to his clothes, seeped into his skin, and made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. He could feel the warmth being leached from his body, and he shivered, not from the temperature alone, but from the sheer wrongness of the phenomenon. This was a cold that did not belong to the living world. His gaze remained locked on her face, and he raised his hand, his fingers outstretched, moving with an agonizing slowness. He had to touch it. He had to prove to himself that it was a solid, inanimate object, to break the spell with the simple, grounding reality of physical contact. His trembling fingertips hovered for a second just before the surface of the painting, the intense cold radiating from it making his skin tingle. He could see the fine, web-like cracks in the dark varnish, the tiny ridges of dried paint that formed her tragic face. He finally allowed his fingers to make contact, not with the canvas itself, but with the heavy, ornate, gilded frame that surrounded it. The moment his skin touched the tarnished gold, a low, guttural, scraping sound echoed through the dead silence of the attic. It was a sound that vibrated not just in the air, but through the wood of the frame and directly into his bones. It was a deep, resonant noise, like stone grinding against stone, and it did not come from the house settling or the wind outside. It came from the portrait itself. He snatched his hand back as if he had been burned, a strangled cry catching in his throat. He stared, wide-eyed, his heart seeming to stop in his chest. The scraping sound continued, growing louder, accompanied now by a horrifying, slow, and protracted creak of ancient, strained wood. Before his disbelieving eyes, the entire painting, frame and all, began to move. It did not fall from the wall. It swung forward, away from the chimney breast, moving on unseen hinges with a dreadful, deliberate slowness. It was a door. The portrait was a secret door, and his touch had somehow unlocked it. As it swung open, it revealed not the rough stone of the chimney behind it, but a dark, rectangular, hollow space, a void of perfect, impenetrable blackness concealed within the wall. The musty, funereal smell that permeated the attic intensified, rushing out from this hidden compartment with renewed, sickening strength. For a long moment, Sir Bael could do nothing but stare, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. The sheer, calculated secrecy of it all was staggering. A hidden room, concealed by a hidden door, disguised as a family portrait, locked away in a forbidden attic. This was not a place for storing valuables. This was a place for entombing a secret so terrible it needed to be buried under layers of concealment, forgotten by time itself. His fear, which had been a sharp, piercing thing, now transformed into a different kind of dread, a heavy, suffocating certainty that he was on the verge of a discovery he would regret for the rest of his life. The house had led him here, had guided his every step, and this was its final revelation. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. He fumbled to pick up his candle from the crate where he had placed it, its flame trembling violently in his unsteady hand, casting wild, dancing shadows that made the attic seem alive with frantic, silent motion. He held the light up to the opening. The hollow space was not large, perhaps only a few feet deep and a few feet wide, like a small, upright coffin set into the wall. The interior was lined with a dark, velvet-like material, now faded to a dusty purple and showing signs of mildew, but still retaining a ghost of its former richness. And there, nestled in the very center of the velvet lining, resting as if it had been placed there only yesterday, was a single, solitary object. It was a letter. It was an old letter, the paper yellowed to the color of brittle bone, its edges folded with a neat, precise geometry. It was sealed shut with a large, circular blob of dark red wax, the color of dried blood. The wax was still intact, the seal unbroken, stamped with a signet he could not quite make out in the flickering light. It seemed to pulse in the candlelight, a tiny, dark heart at the center of the hidden compartment. It was not covered in dust or cobwebs like everything else in the attic. It was pristine, clean, as if it existed outside the slow, relentless decay of the room. It seemed to have been waiting there, untouched by time, preserved by the weight of its own secrets, waiting for the one person who was meant to find it. His heart, which had seemed to stop, now began to pound with a savage, painful force, a wild drumbeat of terror and morbid fascination. This was the core of the mystery. This was the secret the house had guarded for so long. The answers he hadn't even known he was seeking were contained in this single, fragile envelope. His hand, acting with a will of its own, began to reach into the cold, dark space. His fingers were numb, clumsy, as if they belonged to someone else. As his trembling fingertips brushed against the dry, brittle paper of the letter, a sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the outside of the house. The single, grimy attic window rattled furiously in its frame, the sound like a frantic, desperate fist beating against the glass, trying to get in. And carried on that sudden, violent howl of wind, a new sound emerged, a sound that was not the wind. It was a voice, a whisper. It was faint, ethereal, and seemed to come from all around him at once. A disembodied sound that coiled its way directly into his ear. It was a woman's voice, filled with an unutterable, heartbreaking sorrow. It was so faint he almost thought he had imagined it, a phantom of the wind's mournful cry. But it was there, clear and undeniable, a single sorrowful exhalation of a name that seemed to hang in the icy air for a moment before dissolving back into the silence. Mary! The sound, the name, lanced through him like a shard of ice. It was a name of no significance to him, a name without a face, but in the context of this place, it was filled with a terrifying power. His fingers finally closed around the letter, the paper unnaturally cold, as if it had absorbed the chill of the hidden compartment. He drew it out into the candlelight, his eyes fixed on the unbroken, blood-red seal. The whisper still echoed in his mind, a ghostly signature to the discovery. He was no longer just an explorer in a derelict house. He was a participant. He had been given a clue from beyond the grave, a key to a story he was now inextricably a part of. He stood there, in the suffocating silence of the attic, the cold letter in his hand, the mocking eyes of the portrait staring down at him, the ghostly whisper of a forgotten name his only companion. The secret was in his hands, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his very soul, that opening it would change everything. A hidden letter, a lost heir, and the ghost of a tragedy. The secrets of Mardykes Hall are just beginning to surface. What dark truth does this letter hold? And who is the true heir? Let us know your theories in the comments below. Thanks for braving the shadows with Gravevale Echoes. What creepy secret haunts you? Subscribe, share your fears, and return for more gothic chills from the unseen world.